For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
You were in the first democratic parliament. What were your expectations?
You know, we didn't really understand how Parliament was run. But even if it had been run in a particular way, we wanted to achieve some goals in Parliament, and some of us discussed what it was that we wanted to do in order to make Parliament a more accessible institution, to make Parliament an institution where people were not concerned purely with formalities and procedures and things like that. Now, I was elected for the ANC, not for the National Party, by the way. I was head of political education for the ANC at the time. And I remember I wrote a paper called The ANC Inside and Outside Parliament. I don't know what has happened to it, but that paper was trying to ensure that the ANC parliamentarians did not lose touch with the ANC constituency, and I myself conceived the ANC at the time as primarily a national liberation movement, a popular organization. So people like myself and many others were concerned that if we went to Parliament, we would still have this connection with the masses. Now, we went to Parliament, but we didn't really understand, you know, when you go there, and there are procedures in place, you have to operate according to those procedures until you change them. And I was one of those who got onto what was called the Rules Committee. And before we got to Parliament, what are now called portfolio committees were not open to the public. They met in secret, and no one knew what they really did other than rubber stamp what the executive wanted or if they did anything besides that. And the reforms that we initiated for the first time made these committees open to the public, and people were enabled to come and make representations to Parliament through those committees. So if you were in the Land Committee, for example, people could come and make representations, as they have done, over various land restitution legislation, others in recent times, and the Traditional Courts Bill. Now, that sort of thing was not possible before 1994. And we made other suggestions. I don't know what has happened to the one. One of them was to the effect that people did not have to wear suits and ties. And because we believed that you could be equally neat wearing jeans and a shirt. And that was the recommendation. I thought it was adopted, but it seems to have disappeared since those days. And people now believe that they must dress formally. But more important than that was the idea that we believed that Parliament had to be taken to the people. In other words, if you wanted to do some things, for example, provision of water in an area that had not had water before, it was important to go to the communities concerned and hear their views, because very often there were these figures about provision of water, and the reality on the ground was sometimes different from that, in that the water pipes were blocked and they had not trained people in the area concerned to unblock this water, and someone in the area like Khofimvaba had to wait for a person to come from people to come from Butterworth to unblock it. Or in some places, women by the way, were primarily the people who had been getting water from the rivers before. So providing water was very important in terms of gender equality. But they would sometimes put the water taps at a place where only men could meet, which had certain sacred qualities which attached to men. And had they consulted with the communities, that would have been avoided. Now, ideally, the parliamentary committees would have gone and investigated some of these things, consulted, as the ministries ought to have done also, but they would have been monitoring this. There were, however, budgetary constraints. On the one hand, saying that people must come to Parliament is dependent on your resources. The South African Chamber of Business had the resources to go to Parliament and to make substantial representations. COSATU, because of its membership, also did have resources, and the COSATU inputs in that period were very impressive. Their critiques of gear and other things were very substantial. So we had in mind that Parliament would be a place where it would have this people-friendly element that was not there before. Now, there were a number of barriers to achieving this, because the tendency is for parliamentary committees to not really have an autonomous role. They are seen, if you go to an ANC caucus, they are seen as transmission belts. Although committees like the Justice Committee would amend prospective legislation, things like that, the overall conception was decided at the level of the executive, and in general it was not possible for the committees to reverse this or modify this or question this. And I think before one says that that is wrong, one should ask whether the committees do develop expertise. And you don't automatically have expertise of a sort that can challenge the expertise that a ministry has from people who work there, specialists, and even if the people have an input to make and they vote for Parliament for a particular purpose, in transit to becoming policy and legislation, there's certain technical things that go in. So I don't know that it worked adequately, but there was this attempt at the time, and I think it has made a substantial difference. The TCB, the Traditional Courts Bill, had to be withdrawn because at the NCOP level, ANC delegates got mandates that prevented them from pursuing the bill.
On the whole, do you think these aims to make Parliament accessible were realised?
You see, I am not myself sure that a parliamentary committee should be able to override what the executive says, because if the executive of the government is acting on the instructions of the ANC National Executive, that is an elected constitutional structure. Now the MPs, they are elected through ANC processes, but they are bound by what the ANC says. But not all ministers are ANC National Executive members. They're elected by the president. So there's a whole lot of questions of representation which come into whether the people you see, people say they are merely acting as transmission belts of the executive. But what right does a committee necessarily have to try to reverse an executive decision? Is it based on expertise? Now that expertise needs to be developed, but it needs to be acknowledged, and it's never really been articulated properly. The opposition knows what its role is, but the ANC doesn't accord relative autonomy to parliamentary committees. And I think this is one of the questions, and it's very difficult to argue. But I do believe that some of the aims that we had in 1994 have been achieved, in the sense that it's now an accepted fact that representations can be made. They are not always listened to, but they are a way of mobilizing the public so that Parliament has to listen to them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking about South Africa's political scene.